So, every 4 years in America, millions and millions of people go out and cast their ballot for president. But here's a little secret. They're not really voting for the president. Nope, they're actually voting for a small group of people who make up one of the most confusing and controversial parts of the whole system, the Electoral College. So let's dig in and figure out what it is and why it's such a big deal. So who really gets to pick the president? Because it's definitely not as simple as just counting up all the votes across the country. The answer involves this small, select group of people. And believe it or not, their exact role was only just settled by the Supreme Court, and it all happened because a few of them decided to go rogue. Okay, so picture this. It's 2016. In Washington state, the voters chose Hillary Clinton, so the state's electors were all pledged to vote for her. Simple, right? Well, not exactly. 3 of them did something totally unexpected. They cast their votes for Colin Powell instead. It was this long-shot protest vote, an attempt to get other electors to block Donald Trump from becoming president. The plan? Well, it completely failed. And to top it off, Washington state slapped them each with a $1,000 fine for breaking their pledge. Now, $1,000 might not sound like a lot, but that fine sparked a legal battle that went all the way to the Supreme Court. It forced them to finally give an answer on the power of these so-called faithless electors. The whole case hinged on this idea of a faithless elector. That's the official term for an elector who ignores the will of the voters in their state and casts their ballot for someone else. So the big question for the court was pretty simple. Can they do that? Do electors have a constitutional right to just vote their conscience? Well, in 2020, we got our answer, and it was a big, clear, unanimous no. Justice Elena Kagan, writing for the court, said states absolutely have the right to make sure an elector follows through on their pledge. The message was unmistakable. Electors are not free agents. They are bound to the voters. So how did the court come to that conclusion? Well, they looked at 2 things, the Constitution itself and, just history. The Constitution gives states a ton of power over how they appoint electors. And historically, the court pointed out that electors were never really meant to be these independent thinkers. They were just supposed to be, and I love this phrase, trusty transmitters of other people's decisions. Okay, so the court made it crystal clear. Electors have to follow their state's voters. And that, of course, brings up a much bigger question. How does this whole kind of complicated system actually work in the first place? All right, let's break it down. First, you and I, we vote. Then, in nearly every state, the candidate who wins the popular vote in that state gets all of that state's electors. There are 538 electors in total across the country. And to win the presidency, a candidate has to hit that magic number, a majority of 270. And this right here is where the system gets so incredibly controversial. Because winning isn't about getting the most individual votes nationwide. It's about being the first one to 270 electoral votes. And get this, 5 times in U.S. history, that has led to a pretty wild outcome. The person who became president actually lost the popular vote. Yeah, 5 times. Most recently in 2000 and again in 2016. And this gets to the very heart of the whole one person, one vote debate. Because of the way electors are distributed, a vote in a small state actually carries more mathematical weight than a vote in a big state. Just look at the numbers. In Wyoming, there's 1 elector for every 193,000 people or so. But in California, it's 1 elector for every 734,000 people. What that means is that mathematically speaking, not all votes are created equal. This exact imbalance in voting power is a huge reason why there's a serious movement to just get rid of the Electoral College completely. The main arguments for abolishing it are pretty powerful. Opponents say it violates that basic democratic idea of one person, one vote. It also means that if you live in a so-called safe state that always votes one way, your vote can feel less important, which might discourage you from even showing up. And then there's the really thorny history of the system, including some very strong arguments that it was designed to protect the power of slave-holding states. And that point about swing states, that isn't just a theory. The data is pretty stunning. In the 2012 presidential election, 100% of all campaign events happened in just 12 states. 12! That means 38 states were completely ignored by the candidates. Why? Because their electoral votes were already seen as a done deal. The historical argument is really something. Back at the country's founding, southern states got a big boost from the 3/5 compromise, which counted enslaved people for representation even though they couldn't vote.
This gave slaveholding states more electoral votes than they would have had otherwise. And in the election of 1800, that advantage was the literal deciding factor that allowed Thomas Jefferson to defeat John Adams.
But this debate is far, far from one-sided. Defenders of the Electoral College argue that it serves a crucial purpose, one they believe would be totally lost if we switch to a simple national popular vote.
This really all boils down to two completely different ideas about what a presidential election should even be. Is the goal to prevent a tyranny of the majority, where a few huge cities could decide the election for the entire country? Or is the goal to reflect the pure national will, where the person who gets the most votes wins, period?
So defenders argue it's absolutely essential for federalism. It keeps states as key players in the process. They say it protects smaller states from being completely ignored, and they make a really practical point, too. Can you even imagine the absolute chaos of a nationwide recount? The Electoral College at least limits any recount madness to just one or two states at a time. So, with such strong arguments on both sides, what would it actually take to change the system? Well, there are basically two main paths people are talking about. The most direct way to get rid of it is a constitutional amendment, but that is a monumental task. It needs a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate, and then it has to be approved by 3/4 of the states. That's 38 states. On an issue this divisive, that's what you'd call a political near impossibility. Because amending the Constitution is so hard, a really clever workaround has emerged: the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Basically, states who join pass a law agreeing to give all their electoral votes to whoever wins the national popular vote, even if that person lost in their state. The catch is, this whole thing only kicks in once enough states to total 270 electoral votes have signed on. So, how close are they? Well, right now, states with 195 electoral votes have signed on. That means they're still 75 votes short of that magic 270 number needed to make it a reality. So it's a serious movement for sure, but it's still got a pretty long way to go. Which brings us right back to the central question this entire debate boils down to. Is the presidency a choice made by a federation of states, where each state gets a distinct voice, or is it a choice made by the American people as a single collective body? The answer to that question determines everything.